Welcome to Shifting Views with Willis. My name's Wayne Willis. This podcast is all about shifting views in business, community and society. Now, unless you've been living under a rock for the last couple of weeks, you'll know that there's a general election happening. You'll be seeing stuff on your TV screens, party political broadcasts and politicians knocking on your door. And around about a month ago, we also had local elections across the UK as well. And you'll have been seeing the same sort of thing. But what does it all mean? They want your vote. What do they want your vote to do? What does your vote even really mean? Do you understand what it is that you're voting for, who you're voting for, or how the political system works? In this podcast today, we're going to be breaking some of that down and try and get some answers to help you understand all about the political system. I'm delighted to have the leader of Hull City Council, the Liberal Democrat leader, Mike Ross. Welcome, Councillor Ross.
Morning. Hi there.
First podcast?
I think so, yes.
Yeah. Is this a good time for you to be sitting down and resting your feet? Have you been treading the pavement?
Yeah, well, I was out yesterday delivering leaflets in the morning and knocking some doors in the afternoon. And I was feeling a bit this morning. I thought I'm not as young as I used to be, certainly.
Yeah. Do you get excited about elections? Do politicians get excited about elections?
So, do politicians get excited about elections? Some of us are born campaigners. I do actually really enjoy going out campaigning. Delivering leaflets is great for the exercise, but going out and knocking doors and speaking to people is fantastic because you get to hear from people what they think, what's important to them, what matters in their lives. And if all the political parties might put out their views on what needs to happen in society, actually going out and engaging with the public themselves is a really, really important thing to actually really know what's important out there. They're the people who are going to tell you what really matters. And so going out and speaking to them is fantastic.
Yeah, I always imagine it being a bit like, you get nervous about a job interview. I sort of sense it as like a job interview, like every time you go out, but you're being interviewed by thousands of people.
Yeah. I mean, I always think, as a councillor, my employer is the 10,000 voters who live in the ward that I represent, and that's a lot of bosses to have. And as you say, going out, you have to, you keeps you grounded and makes you remember that actually they're the people that you're out there to work for.
Yeah. So you're a leader of Hull City Council. So that's a city council. How does a national election affect a regional leader?
So, I mean, in simple terms, obviously the two are different. I lead the city council, which is different to the government. I'm not a candidate in this election, so I'm not sort of directly invested in the sense of, will I or will I not get elected. But in terms of what happens at national level, it has a very big impact on the local. So as councils, we get a significant amount of our funding, for example, from national government. So the national policy of the governing party on local government funding is a big issue for us. The sort of policies they outroll in terms of what they want to see local government do, that is a big issue for councils. So, although this is a general election, the result of it is important to what happens at local level as well.
About a month ago, so it would be May 2024, we had local elections across the country. And people were voting for all sorts of different things there, because you were voting for councillors for your area. You were voting for, in some areas, police and crime commissioners. Police and crime commissioners, that's the one. And in some areas, you were voting for mayors. Yeah. What is the difference between all of these things? And also, in terms of a general election, we're now voting for MPs. So if we was to say MP, councillor, PCC, as they're referred to, and mayors, that all merges into one for so many people.
Yeah.
Can you define the breakdown between what those four things actually mean?
Yeah, I understand if you're not sort of directly involved necessarily, it is sort of quite hard to understand who are these different politicians voting for, why do we have so many? And actually, if you compare us to places like the US, we don't actually elect as many officials as some people do in some places. So the council is responsible for delivering local services, be it things like waste collection, some community safety issues, social services. So adults and children social services is a big core part of what local government does. Yeah. And that's a really important aspect to it. As local councillors, we're also there to represent local people. I like to think that as a councillor, as a city councillor, I represent the people to the council rather than the council to the public. Police and crime commissioners, I mean, hopefully it's a bit clear in their title, but essentially the Police and Crime Commissioner is there to hold the police force to account and help direct their direction in broad terms, not the day-to-day operational side, that's for the chief constable, but to hold them to account for what they're doing. And also some aspects in terms of the crime aspects around they have some responsibility for crime prevention measures, and they work with local councils and others on some of those things. The mayors are a fairly recent introduction into the British political system. They've been around now for about 10 years or so. They largely, so I think the big mistake that was made by the government in terms of this post was calling them mayors. Because people think of a mayor, they think, well, like Mayor of New York or Mayor of Paris, there's someone who's running a big city.
Yeah, well, a friend of mine, I had this in the question because a friend of mine asked me the other week, and he said, they're talking about bringing a mayor into Hull or into our region. Yeah. He said, don't we already have a mayor? And I said, well, we have a Lord Mayor, but as I understand it, that's some form of kind of ceremonial role. Yeah. What's the difference?
No, it is a real problem, because actually it was a really poor choice of title. The mayor, where you get a directly elected mayor in most places, they're a person who's responsible for running that place, and that's not what the mayors the sort of regional mayors that we have in this country are. So where the mayors in this sort that we're talking about, they oversee, say, 5, 6, maybe more council areas, and they are there to essentially the economic development role. So about bringing in economic investment into area, helping jobs grow, helping business, skills, issues like that. They're not there to do the day-to-day services around bins and street cleaning, all that sort of stuff. That sticks with the council. You say, in Hull we have a Lord Mayor. That is a ceremonial title. So the Lord Mayor is one of the councillors, gets elected to serve for a year, and they represent the city and represent the council. And people love seeing them, but they're not there in terms of any sort of. They're a bit like. Well, I won't sound too grand about this. Sometimes people describe the Lord Mayor being a bit like the monarch, the king, and the leader of the council being a bit like the Prime Minister. So I don't let that go to my head. I don't sort of compare myself to the Prime Minister in that sense, but in terms of the power, in terms of the responsibility.
Yeah.
And then MPs, so MPs are elected. They're there to then represent a constituency. So probably around I think sort of 65,000 residents in a constituency. There's about over 600 of them in the country, and they essentially, whoever gets the most MPs goes on to generally form the government.
Right. One of the questions I get quite a lot, particularly around the police and crime commissioners, why do we need... It's a relatively new role, isn't it, in the scheme of things? So a few years now.
It was 2013.
Yeah.
I remember the first election was November, so dark, cold day for an election. November, the first election, we had turnout.
The look on your face when you said that, it was dark,
it was not a lot of fun, those elections in 2013. I remember where I was. It was not a lot of fun, and it was horrible, basically. So, yeah. And we had turnout about 12%, I think, across the country for those elections, because they were new posts. And, let's go back to my earlier point around, we don't actually elect to a lot of official positions in this country. I think this was kind of the government's attempt to try and bring almost like sheriffs that they have in the US, where they elect to those posts. They replaced something called police authorities, which were a committee composed of councillors from the relevant council areas that police force covered. So, for example, Humberside Police, that covers Hull and East Riding, North Links and North East Links. And there was a committee of councillors that were from those 4 council areas.
Yeah.
The reason they came in to put the case for them, I think it was around having one accountable figure, someone that was more known to the community than the police authority members were, and someone who individually could have the responsibility to hold the police to account. There's others, a view I sort of accord to, that took the view, well, look, police authorities worked. If they were changing, we make those changes to make them better to do it on an accountable basis across the 4 council areas, rather than just having one person elected to do that post. Yeah.
Because I suppose the question would be, if you weren't into politics and you was just your everyday Joe, you would say, okay, so we have an MP that represents us at a national level, and then we have local councils elected to, keep us safe, keep us healthy, all the rest of it in the region. Why do we need another person to then be talking about looking at crime? Does the MP not look at crime? Does the council not look at crime? Why do we need another elected official?
Well, I guess in a sense, it's that official replaced the police authority, which was doing some of that. And again, there is some stuff around the benefits of working partnership. So the police crime commissioner and the police work in partnership with the local councils and with other organisations, voluntary community sector organisations, for example. So there is some pluses to it. whether though that is better than having a police authority that represented the full council areas, I guess time will tell.
Yeah. I just wonder if it creates confusion and that creates apathy for voting.
So I think, well, picking up that last point first, in terms of the motivation to vote, I think people need to feel an engagement with what they're voting for to go and vote. I think that's certainly true. And I think actually where you get higher levels of voting at local level is often where there's more competitive election and where there's, say, 2 or 3 parties going out working hard to get people to vote. In terms of the recognition, so it's really, the other aspect of this is around what motivates people to go vote, the way they vote. Yeah. If you look at local council elections, sometimes they can be people voting on local issues, which is what you'd want for local council elections.
Sure.
Sometimes it's national issues that dominate. So if you go back to sort of late 2010s, there were definitely national issues post the Brexit referendum, for example, that were very dominant in people's thought processes when they were going to vote. Last couple of years, I think at times there's been much more local issues that have affected people for council elections. The PCC elections I found very interesting in terms of this issue, because I think quite often you look at what's happened nationally with those, it's been much more around people's dominant political view in terms of their party that has influenced which way they vote, rather than necessarily how well that particular incumbent has done in the last 4 years.
Sure. Okay, so let's talk about regional mayors. There's been a lot of talk about devolution. Arguably, it's been successful in some areas of the country. We've seen a lot of famous, I guess, mayors across the country doing a lot of media. Andy Burnham is a prime example. Andy Street, I think, is was the Birmingham or the Midlands. Is it
West Midlands?
West Midlands, regional mayor. And you talked about earlier, you said, look, essentially they're brought in to try and bring economic growth to a region, a collective of regions. And as part of that, we hear the word devolution all the time. And when I think of devolution, I immediately think of kind of Wales or Scotland, Northern Ireland, devolve into countries and letting them control a certain amount of things. But what does it mean at a regional level? And should Hull and our region be considering devolution?
So in terms of what devolution means, I think so. You're right to think of Wales and Scotland when you think of devolution. You know, in pure terms, devolution should be about the government devolving, so handing over power and responsibility to another area, whatever level that might be. I think if we're honest, the sort of devolution that we have in England under the current government structure is more about handing over cash, frankly, to local areas to spend. And that's good. I'm not knocking the idea of giving local places the power to spend that cash, but it's probably less so in terms of the powers and responsibilities. So if you were a purist or a sort of a political theorist on this sort of stuff, you'd probably sort of wince slightly at the way they've used the term devolution here. But the general principle is the right thing to do, and sort of there is pretty much broad cross-party agreement on the idea that devolution is a good thing, and I think all the parties would say they want to see more of it to the lowest level. I think if you look in terms of, it's saying that decisions should be taken at the most appropriate level to where that decision, with the emphasis being on as low down as possible, that should be a good guiding principle. Will we get devolution for Hull riding? I guess is kind of the follow-on question of sorts.
There's a lot of chatter, isn't there?
Well, quite. And I think, so we've, just to give sort of an update in terms of where we're up to on this one, we've got to a point where we have an agreement, a deal, as it's called, in place with the government. That has been agreed by the government and both the council and Hull and East Riding. It would be a devolution area that covers just those two councils, so it is smaller than any others really that's around there, but it can be made to work. The current proposal is around a mayoral devolution proposal, so there would be one of the mayors coming in if that goes through. Obviously, the general election happening when it did has seen a pause on that process, so that some of the process requires, for example, approval through Parliament. At the moment, there's no Parliament, so that can't take place. So essentially, we're processing as much as we can on this, doing as much progress as we can to get to the point where it's then up to a new government, whoever that might be after the general election, to pick this issue up and to set out where they want to go with it. There is support for devolution to happen here. Is now going to be over to the government to sort out what happens. Yeah.
What's your gut feeling, dare I ask? Can you say?
So I think I say there's, at a national level, there's broad support for the principle of devolution.
Yeah.
They just need to decide a new government needs to decide what that means for them.
Yeah. I mean, again, just linking the two topics. So we talked about police and crime commissioners and we talked about mayors. And I think, again, that was another series of questions I was getting where there's, you would hear about it. There's talk about having a mayor coming into our region, devolving, a certain amount of money coming into the region, and those figures kind of vary what they are. But again, the Joe public kind of sort of says, why? So we have our MPs, we have our councillors. Now we're going to have another person who we're going to vote for, and they're going to determine, how our area grows or how investment comes in. Would one kind of replace the other, or does it supersede what we've already got?
So I think the important thing to recognise about this is, so I'm the leader of Hull City Council, so I'm a councillor for Hull. There's 57 councillors in Hull. We're responsible for the city.
Yeah.
Devolution and the mayor and the combined authority and so on would be about the wider region, so Hull and East Riding.
Yeah.
And at the moment, there isn't anything that oversees that. Now, Hull and East Riding councils work together. We talk about it in terms of it being an economic area. Business and others, kind of see that boundary between Hull and East Riding is a very artificial thing. It doesn't really apply to them.
Yeah.
People live in one area and work in the other. They do business across both.
Yeah.
So actually there is something around working together for the region being a good thing.
Yeah.
And the combined authority that would go with the mayor essentially is something to oversee that and actually say, look, we are working for this whole area rather than just one patch or the other.
On to general election then. That's the big hot news that's happening at the moment. A couple of quick fire stuff. Hopefully you can just clear it up and answer the question and then we can get to it. Firstly, can you explain first past the post system? So just for clarity for listeners here, a lot of questions that I get asked all the time about this is, one vote for one person doesn't necessarily count in terms of putting somebody in the House of Commons. It doesn't get you an MP. So you could get like millions and millions of votes, but actually you wouldn't get the MP in the House of Commons because you're not in the particular right area or you didn't get the votes in the right area. Which to me doesn't seem democratic. I'm a bit confused by that. So if you could just explain how the system works.
I thought your first question was going to be why the Prime Minister called the election when he did. Which
everybody would like to know. That's in there. Hold that thought.
One. Okay. So in terms of first past the post, so first past the post is essentially like the clue is in the name. So essentially it's a case of you elect a person to represent the area. The person who wins is the one that gets the most votes for that area. And that's not over 50% of the votes. That is literally whoever gets more votes than anybody else. So you could, if you have 6 candidates, they could all get about 15% of the votes, say, and the one who gets 16% is the one who goes on to win. Some people like first past the post because they like the fact that it is clear, straightforward, and simple. Others, the point you're making in terms of it doesn't seem very democratic. Others say there should be a proportional system where you allocate the number of people you're electing based on the proportion of votes that people have done across a wider region.
If you're in a room and you sort of say who wants red and who wants blue, and everybody puts their hands up, and you say, right, well, 7 want this and 3 want that, that's democratic. You say, we're going with 7. That's the democratic vote. Our system kind of doesn't suggest that, and therefore, I guess my follow-up question to that is, can smaller parties ever really become a government? It will always be a Labour or Conservative government based on the system that allocate. There's no other way to win, is there?
It undoubtedly presents a challenge, first past the post, to smaller parties. And without going too party political, as a member of a smaller party myself, I recognise that challenge.
Yeah.
I guess the challenge then is around how they maximise the resources in certain places. So in this election, for example, we have the situation where there is one party that is expected to do very well across the country in terms of votes, but probably not do very well in terms of number of people elected. And that's because their votes will be spread fairly uniformly across the whole country. Other parties,
which is a good thing in this case, I think. Well, we're talking about. But anyway, we won't talk about that. Go on.
Other parties might see that their vote isn't necessarily particularly high across the whole country, but if they do well maximising in certain seats, they get a good number of MPs returned. So, for example, the Liberal Democrats could actually be in a position where we get fewer votes as a percentage than the last election 5 years ago, but return many more MPs if the vote is concentrated in the right places. And that's the case of the parties being more efficient around where they target their resources to get the maximum return.
Yeah, and I think there's a fair argument to say if you're a particular small party or particularly maybe even a fringe party, whatever the spectrum you're on, there is a danger to it because you can get people into very powerful positions that have essentially got their vote through, I guess populism and whichever side of the spectrum you're on. So that with that comes risk. But arguably that's democracy as well. And the people that are vying for our votes, their job is to convince us that they're the one, And I just wonder if you get smaller parties, they're only ever at a national level, they're only ever going to be able to kind of either go into coalition or try and influence what the main parties are doing based on the number of seats that they get in the House. So could the Liberal Democrats ever be a majority government based on our voting system?
Well, I mean, I think essentially that would require more people, based on terms, more people to vote for us. And so the job there is for the parties to go out and campaign hard and gain more support.
But if they did, so just on that note, so if more people voted for you, if you just got millions and millions of votes for Liberal Democrats, is it possible for you to form a majority? I mean, what is a majority? 350, whatever?
Yeah, you need sort of about 326 MPs.
Yeah, so it's a big to get a majority. Is that physically possible for a party of you like Liberal Democrats or the Greens or any others?
I mean, it is a technical possibility in the sense that we stand across the country, we can go out and win seats and votes. I think we recognise that this election, that's not likely to be the outcome.
No.
But what we're potentially also seeing in this election is that the party of government at the moment, a party that's dominated British politics for 100 years, is probably going to return a lot fewer MPs than they've got at the moment, and potentially the fewest they've ever had, which shows that actually change is possible in the political system. So, while this election might not produce a Liberal Democrat government, that's not to say that we can't see growth over successive years. And that is, you have to see each election in isolation, and then also each election in a journey of what's going to happen. We've talked in the past as a nation around, is the Labour Party dead? Well, it looks like this election they're probably going to have a big turnaround and probably get a pretty decent sized cohort of MPs elected. Yeah, there is just change in politics.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's just essentially it's always ping pong in between red and blue, isn't it? I mean, basically, at a national level, we have fluctuations and people go up and people go down, but fundamentally, you're either voting a Tory government or a Labour government at a national level, typically.
But then, that wasn't always the case. To go back 100 plus years, it was the Liberals of old and the Tories, the Whigs, the Conservatives at that time. The Labour Party formed. And actually, it was the Liberals of the day helped them get where they are now. I don't think they really ever thanked them for that. Actually, but so that change is possible. But this election, I think we'll see a different story.
The other thing that I get asked about is the time in government. So when you elect a government, they have a sitting of, say, 5 years. It's about 5 years in power. Is 5 years a reasonable amount of time to genuinely make change? And just to make comparison for again, us Joe Publics at home, if we take out a mortgage or something, it's 25, 35 years for us. If we've set up a business, it's, decades probably, before you really get into the stage of actually having a sustainable change business and all that kind of stuff. And you could apply that to lots of other different analogies. I just wonder with the change that needs to happen, especially if it's culturally or system change, can you realistically do anything in 5 years? Can you really make that change? Or should there be some form of legislation that you're in for a longer period of time, or the policies that are implemented by an incumbent government are continued? They're not just turned off when the next government comes into play.
So I think 5 years is a reasonable amount of time to make change. Now, I guess the issue here is how you're defining change. So implementing change can be done in time. You're right, though, in terms of seeing the outcome and effects of that change is a longer-term thing. And so there's often this thing around a view that in politics there can be a lot of short-term thinking. People can be thinking ahead to the next election rather than actually recognising that some policy impact is something that takes 10 years, 15 years to actually come about. And there's this danger that politicians do stuff because they think that will be popular, and by popular they mean get them votes in the next election, rather than necessarily things that will be not necessarily popular at the time but have longer term benefits. But I think the danger of having much longer than 5 years is actually twofold. One, there's a danger of sort of a sense of power and the corrosive effect of power, and the second side is the impact that government, as we've seen with previous governments, if it is there for too long, can just become stale, frankly. And actually, having like it's a bit like if you have your mortgage, say, you might take it out for 25 years, but with a 5-year term. It's a bit similar to that. Or if you've got a lease to rent a place, you might take a 10-year lease, but with a break clause for 5 years. And so it's a similar sort of principle, I think, having that elections every few years. It's kind of like that break clause.
Yeah, well, so I was chatting to someone about this yesterday. It's why I put the question in, and they were sort of saying, as an example, and you've touched upon it, governments might come in, so they've got a 5-year term, and they might come in and they might make quite exciting policy changes because it resonates well with the voters and that'll get them votes. But actually, in the long term, it has quite negative effects, and when they're gone, you're kind of left with that. So one example I got here was like this idea of leasing over buying. So you might get something quite cheap and infrastructure or something, and to the taxpayer you'd say, look, and we managed to do this and it's cost us bare minimum to buy whatever. But actually the long-term deal of that is that you're paying a leasing thing for 30, 40 years and you're stuck in that world. So in the short term, it looks like a nice win, but in the long term, it's actually negative for the country. So is there a danger? I guess it comes down to accountability, really. I suppose when you're making those decisions and those policy decisions, it's how well that government is held to account about not just what the short-term gain is, but actually what does that look like 30 years from now?
What people say about elections is that is their people's chance to hold people to account, hold the government to account. And, people in power often like say, well, if the public don't like what we're doing, they have the chance at an election to say so and to kick them out, basically.
Yeah.
Which is why I think actually you need to have not too long a period between elections to actually give the power to the public to be able to do that. Now, obviously, the way the system works is a bit sort of not as clear cut as that, but the general principle of that is the election is a chance to hold the governing party or to hold MPs to account, and that's an important thing.
Yeah. And on the topic of holding to account, another one I've got here is House of Commons, House of Lords. So currently we have two houses in our system. Can you firstly, for clarity, define the difference between the two?
In very simple terms, the House of Commons is the elected body. So we choose who our lawmakers are in there. We vote for them. Every person in the country has a chance to elect, well, every voting adult has the chance to elect their member of parliament. The House of Lords is unelected. So the people who are in there have been either appointed to it or, in a small handful of cases, they are elected in that they are a hereditary peer. So someone who has inherited the title from their relative, and then they are chosen, a small group of other hereditary tiers vote for who should be put in the House of Lords when a vacancy occurs. Now, looking at the pros and cons, the pro of the House of Lords is that it's a case of being able to put in experts, they say, put in people of experience of a wide range of different sectors being represented. So it's not a case of, having to get there because you do well at campaign and get people to vote for you. You can, say, bring in someone from the world of, say, maritime or the business world or wherever it is and get them in there to give their views. The negative side, the con, is around, well, surely in a democracy, the public should be able to say who their lawmakers are, rather than it being just because they might happen to know the Prime Minister.
Yeah. So as I understand it, the House of Commons, our elected officials, they legislate, and the House of Lords, they essentially chew that over and see if it, they edit, if you like.
Yeah. So the power of the House of Lords is relatively limited in this. So the House of Lords is a revising chamber, they call it. So
revising. That's the word.
It's able to review the laws that are going through, say yes or no to them, give ideas, make changes.
Yeah.
But if it was in the governing party's manifesto, the line is they're not able to actually stop it. They can hold it up, and sometimes they do, but ultimately they have to let it go through. Policy that comes forward that isn't is a bit different. They are able to delay that for much longer. But generally, the House of Lords, while it might cause problems for the government, you generally see the legislation go through. Now, this is potentially an argument. Yes, great that you get a house of so-called experts there, but if it doesn't actually have the power to stop stuff, because it's not democratically elected, would it be better to have it elected?
What I do like about the House of Lords in terms of people being elected or not elected to it, but being appointed to it, is that, maybe they come from a professional background. They're from a world of business or health or education or defence or whatever it is they're from, and so they've got real world experience to scrutinise legislation, and that I totally get. But there are lots of people that get sent to the House of Lords that frankly shouldn't be sent to the House of Lords. And, we have the whole thing. I don't really understand the idea that a Prime Minister can leave and just make a massive list of names and go, you're all now peers. Yeah. Based on what? Based on essentially you supported me or, you donated or whatever it is. And I don't want to get too much into that, but I just wonder if, it's just becoming such a massive house with lots and lots of people sent there all the time. Is it really, and as you say, they can't really make change for the most part. They can't stop legislation for the most part. So is it relevant, I guess is the question.
So I think it does, in our constitutional system, serve a useful purpose. And I would definitely have a second chamber. I think the House of Lords does do some great stuff. And there are some very honourable people in the House of Lords who do fantastic work. If I was designing the system from scratch, would I have a House of Lords which was appointed in this way? Probably not. I like the idea of democracy and electing people to be representatives in the system.
Could there potentially be a third house, what I would call a citizens' assembly or a public house or something like that? And that would work in the same way as jury duty. You would be randomly selected from across the country to serve a period of time within that citizens' assembly, and your job is to scrutinise the legislation that comes through, so that as regular members of the public, if you like, from all backgrounds at random selection, they can put their input on saying that just doesn't represent us, or it works brilliantly for us, or it resonates in what we actually live with day to day. So often I guess the negative side of being a politician, or what you get pointed at, is saying you don't resonate, you're not from our world, particularly the wealthy ones that are in cabinet. They're just not connected to that world. So how could they make legislation, genuine legislation that makes a difference to a regular person, if they can't resonate with that? Would a third house help that?
So I think there's all sorts of ways. So you could do directly elected. You could do like a citizens' assembly type model. You could, for example, say, I think it's France, they have the situation where their second chamber is composed of regional leaders, so mayors and equivalents of council leaders, for example. So there's that sort of model. Whether we'll necessarily see great reform of the House of Lords, it's been talked about for years. So obviously you go back a couple of decades ago, you had the situation where it was pretty much hereditary peers were a dominant force, and there were some life peers. They got rid of quite a lot of the hereditary peers under the last Labour government. But that sort of thing around massive change to House of Lords has been talked about for so long. I just think actually even a new government will probably stick with what we've got and make a few tinkering. They've talked about, for example, when you get to the age of 80, having to leave the House of Lords. That's not actually wholesale change. It's not massive change. It's tinkering around the edges. And I don't think really we'll see major change to the House of Lords anytime soon.
No. Why be a politician? And I've bracketed here, is this a career thing? Is it a power-hungry thing? Is it, for some people, are they bred, I would argue most of the prime ministers have come from kind of private schools. They're probably bred to be leaders. It's kind of what they're informed about. But generally across the board, it's not a particularly high-paying gig. So it can only be you genuinely want to make change. It's like a philanthropic kind of, charitable thing, or it's career, or it's power. What is it? Why would you do the job?
I think for 99% of people who go into politics, it's because they generally, and without to sound too cliched about this, want to make a difference probably in their local area. Yeah, quite often you'll hear stories about people, certainly at sort of council level, who'll say, well, I became a councillor because so-and-so asked me to stand. It wasn't because they had this long-held desire to get into the world of politics. It's because someone came to them and said, I think you'll be quite good at this. Can you come and stand for us?
Yeah.
And for most people, they go into it not out of a sense of ambition, not because they want to become Prime Minister even. It's because they think, well, actually, that I can do something for my local area. When you get to national level, undoubtedly, there's some of that still. There's also a bit to, a sense of actually the bigger stage, the idea of, you use the word power, I think for some, potentially that is the case. Those who have ambitions to get to the top, with them, they can be quite driven and they will sort of do the things that help them get to that point. But ultimately, I think why be a politician is because you actually can do something for your local area. And actually, the things that make most difference to me, we're talking about devolution, for example. That's a massive thing for the region, £300 million of money and all this sort of stuff, and that's all great. But the things I get most satisfaction out of is when I'm able to help an individual with a problem that they've had for months and actually help them get it sorted. And that actually, I think, is a real reason to go into politics.
Yeah, I would agree. I would say certainly at a regional, local level, councillors or local MPs, I think probably are in it for the right reason. And we see a lot of stuff in media, and media is all about headlines and kind of creating buzz and controversy. But for the most part, I think I would agree 99% of people are in there because they think they can do something, they can make a difference, and that's really in their values and what they're about. Yeah, definitely. I always think when you get to the national level, and this is why I don't think it'll ever really change, because has there been a prime minister that hasn't come from essentially a private upbringing, from wealth, from it? Can you think of one that's...
well, John Major, actually, I think had a Reddit, so he wasn't sort of your typical Oxbridge type prime minister. He was slightly different. But
they all essentially go through that world.
I think it's fair to say a lot of them have had sort of privileged or certainly better upbringings than most. I think, though, that is probably symptomatic of the structural issues we have in this country that stop people from those backgrounds getting high up. We see some exceptions. Angela Rayner, for example, has been very clear about the sort of background she'd come from. But a vast majority of people who have achieved power have come from a better off background than others.
Could somebody like Angela Rayner or somebody similar in that kind of background world, could they be a prime minister? Could they become the prime minister realistically?
I think much more so now than, say, 50, 60, 70 years ago. Yeah, I think we are in a more open society. Whether there's still more work to do, well, probably so, but it's probably more open than it has ever been. Yeah.
If you was to become the health secretary, the defence secretary, the education secretary, whatever, you're essentially looking after that area for the whole country. That's what you're elected to do. But should you come from a background in that world, is like, how can you look after... If I went for a job as a hospital manager, I would never get the job because I just don't know anything about hospitals, so it would be a pointless area. Or to become a head teacher or something. So how can you do that at a national level?
So I actually take the view that there are times when it can be an advantage, obviously, to have an experience, but actually for me, I wouldn't have an education secretary, say, who'd been a teacher, because I think the danger is if you've worked in that field, you have potentially a set way of thinking about things.
Maybe.
Blinkered is perhaps a strong word, but a sense of you often will grow up with a particular, or you have a sort of working life that has a particular view that you've done it in. The role of the education secretary is to deliver the best education system in the country, say. It is to work with a whole range of people, to consider all different range of views and perspectives, and to make decisions taking all of that into account. So it's not to do so from their own necessarily preconceived position. So I'm not saying that it can't be yet helpful at times to have an experience or understanding, but I don't think it should be a requirement either.
Yeah, and I'm purposely poking that question because in my world, in what I do with innovation, I go to businesses and exactly what I say to them regarding the culture of the business. I say, look, you can almost become institutionalized, but by your own walls.
I think
your own.
It should be about skills and competency rather than necessarily background experience. And as I say, background experience can be helpful, but it's their ability to do the role that's actually important. And there's a difference between being the political lead, say, and being a manager.
Yeah. No, that's true. And it goes back to our earlier point of saying people that could become prime minister or senior leaders, they don't necessarily need to come from wealth and Oxbridge and, inherited titles and all the rest of it. Actually, somebody from, a council estate in Hull could potentially work their way up to that level and have a completely different perspective on particularly things around poverty, inequality, which this country is essentially rife with. Somebody from that level might be able to have a different spin on what that looks like.
Yeah, definitely.
So there's an argument for that. How accountable are politicians for the decisions that they make? They come into office, they do their thing, they leave office. Fundamentally, they leave whatever's left, and then somebody else comes in and kind of picks up the tread. Is there really accountability?
So going back to the point before around the elections being the time for the public to hold people to account, I think that is true, but only to an extent. But I think there is much more accountability than people think. So I think the political system is under a lot of scrutiny from the public, media and others. So I think that gives it a fair bit of accountability.
Has that made a huge difference, the change in social media and the access to media? Is that really affected?
So social media, I think, is a really interesting thing on this, in the sense of I feel that as a sort of leading politician, I should be on social media and sort of be out there and be accountable and be open and accessible and so on. And that's great. The danger of it is that it can be sort of too accessible for some, and I think that is, we've seen the problems that's caused for certain leading figures. Mainstream or traditional media, we've got a situation now, certainly on a local level, where there's basically just less of it than it was 10, 15 years ago. And some people say to me, well, that must be great for you, because you could do whatever you want and there's no scrutiny. And actually, I think, well, I think that scrutiny is healthy in democracy.
Yeah.
But also, B, the other side of it is we in the political system need the media to help get across our message, be that, sometimes a political message, but actually just from a council point of view, if there's things that are happening that we need people to know about, using the mainstream media is a way of doing that. And if there isn't as much local media out there for us to get that message out there, that actually does cause problems.
There's an argument to say that mainstream media pretty much typically is biased because they're on a spectrum, usually on one side or the other. So you have right-wing papers, left-wing papers, all that kind of stuff. So from that point of view, yeah, it's great for getting your message across, but only if they're on your side. So actually, do you think the growth of social media has actually been able to neutralise messaging a little bit, or actually has it just made it more inflammatory?
So I'd say, people talked about Obama and he won the presidential election on social media. And yeah, undoubtedly they did a lot of social media in that election when he got elected, but they also put out a lot of leaflets. They also did a lot of the traditional campaigning and so on.
Yeah.
So social media has its place, but it doesn't replace what is there before, in my view.
Yeah.
And as much as the mainstream media, a lot of it may be sort of have a particular standpoint on issues, I think also social media, it is good to get a message out, but I wouldn't say it necessarily changes opinion so much as either as people may think.
Yeah.
There's still a lot of sort of confirmation bias on social media.
Yeah,
people
sure.
will watch it with a particular view and may follow the sort of accounts that they like and that they accord with, rather than necessarily do it to find out what's going on and change their position on things.
Well, I suppose there's an argument as well, which is why I think we have such strong areas of like populism and stuff like that, because if you're interested in a particular subject, then the algorithm will kind of massively associate you with all the narrative that kind of spins around that. And then you kind of get caught in that bubble of this is life and you kind of miss this. Do politicians feel held to account by media? Do you fear media? Do you respect media? What's your relationship to it?
I think there has to be a healthy relationship with it. Fear is probably a strong word. I think we recognise its value and its importance. I think the danger of the word fear is that it implies that actually politicians are all naturally doing something wrong. That should be a case. Actually, what it should be a case.
Which I wasn't suggesting.
No, indeed, I'm not sure. But what I'm saying is a sense of actually it should be there as a part of the process of getting out information about what's happening.
Yeah.
And some of that is good and some of that is bad, but it should be a relationship that enables both to do their role in that.
Are politicians media trained to answer questions in a certain way and to get their party political message across?
Some are, some aren't, and I think undoubtedly the higher up the political echelon you go, the more likely they will be. So, undoubtedly senior front rank politicians in the House of Commons, for example, will get media training. Is that a good thing, a bad thing? I think on balance, it is a good thing that they get training as you would in any other job. The extent to which they are polished and hold a line to the point where you think, well, I don't really understand what that means anymore. Then that's dangerous. But actually, I'd rather people were doing a competent job than actually being made to look silly all the time in the media.
The old cliche is that politicians never answer questions. That's kind of the cliche. And that's usually because they're, as you say, they're holding a line, and they'll say, yeah, but are you going to do whatever? And they'll say, well, we're going to. And they've got a very specific set of words. And I've seen loads of memes recently of Rishi Sunak, who's particularly bad for it, and this is my opinion on it. But, and you'll put his clips together and they're identical, word for word, does not deviate from the point. And then it's robotic and it's not credible because you just learn a script and you're repeating that script as many different ways. And of course, you want to get that clipped up into the news. You want that 10-second soundbite. So you just keep hammering that clip. But does that then just break connection with...
So the media training these days about giving away all the secrets, I think much more would encourage people to actually give an answer to the question.
Right.
And actually just holding a line. You'll want to get across your message, so you'll know where you want to land with what you're saying, but you need to give the answer as well. So it's a case of getting from point A to B in that process.
Yeah. Should politicians, do you think, own their backgrounds as well? This is another thing that I find interesting. So, like, if you're from a poorer background, so again, harping back to say Angela Rayner or somebody like that, they'll happily say, look, I grew up on a council estate, I had children when I was young, these are all the things that happened, and that's their way of saying, look, I'm one of you, I've been through it, I know, kind of thing. If you're from the higher end of it, if you're from Oxbridge and you've got loads of money and all that kind of stuff, there never seems to be an ownership of that. It seems to be more of trying to relate to. And I always think if I was, say, Rishi Sunak or any of the wealthy ones, I would say, own who you are. Yes, I am exceptionally wealthy. I've come from this background. I can't help that. It is what it is, and this is what I think. But here's why I think that adds value, rather than saying that doesn't exist and I am, I'm actually, with you guys. So I think, should you own it?
Yeah, I think the public, in my experience, there's a recognition that we vote for individuals. Yes, we vote for parties, but also vote for a person.
Yeah.
And I think people want to know much more about the people they're voting for. And of course, some of that is who they are, where they come from, their background. And you can't help what your background is.
No.
It is what it is. So, yeah, I don't think you necessarily should run away from it. Now, how you do that is important. You don't want to necessarily lord it over people either. But, recognising you have been formed by your experience is not a bad thing.
Yeah. So how do you think Liberal Democrats are going to do in the general election?
So I will probably be a bit more party political then on this question than the other. So this election, I think it's fair to say the Liberal Democrats go into it pretty optimistic, more so than we have done the last couple of general elections. The political climate obviously is very different. I think, if you talk to a lot of people across the country, there is a mood that they want to change your government, and there's a lot of seats out there where people know that the way to do that is actually by voting Liberal Democrat, because they're the best challenges to the incumbent Tory MP. And so, I think we're going to come out of this election. I said earlier, we might not necessarily get more votes than we got last time, but I'm confident we'll get a lot more seats this time. I couldn't possibly tell you how many. On an optimistic day, it could be 60 plus. On one of my more pessimistic days, it might be more like 35. But undoubtedly, if you look at this campaign so far, I think we've had a pretty good, fun campaign with Ed Davey and all the stuff he's been doing. It's got a lot.
He loves it, doesn't he? He loves it.
I think Ed has done the absolute right thing. This campaign, he's not in any sense pretended that we're going to form the next government. I don't think anybody will take that seriously. But he's done a lot of stuff that's got noticed, and that's made sure people remember we exist. I think the result of that, hopefully, we'll see people come and vote for us, because that is the way to get Conservative MPs to lose in this election, where we're going to do well.
Yeah, I think at a national level, I would say the recent political party broadcast with Ed and his son, I thought was lovely. Really resonates really well.
And I think we were able to do that as a party because people knew who Ed was through all the falling in the Windermere and stuff like that. And the stats, I'm not going to say as a Liberal Democrat, we don't all find it a bit cringy. We recognise it's cringy, but it's got him noticed, and that has helped then actually, talking before about people knowing the person they're voting for, it's helped people understand who Ed Davey is, and then enabled to do that really personal. I think that's a real sort of brave decision to do a party political broadcast like that. That actually really sort of takes a lot of...
Well, and going back to what we talked earlier on about, owning your background and owning your... I think if you genuinely are living that life and, you have a struggle as a carer, then the best way to highlight those struggles is to say, well, look, this is what my experience is. And I think that's probably one bit, I don't know what the polls would show on this, but I would argue that broadcast was probably the strength.
I think, I'm saying the reaction's gone down very well. And you talk about the caring issue. So Ed, when he became leader of the party back in 2020, the party, as a result of Ed becoming leader, had a big focus on the issue of care. And at the time, there was a sense of, well, why are we talking about this? Why are we talking about this? But actually, I think what we've seen is just how relevant it is, because there's something like 8 million carers across the country. And so that affects a lot of households. So actually, it's put a really important issue front and centre and got people talking about it. Finally,
voting turnout is typically not very high at any election these days. How do we improve that? And to follow up to that, how do we get younger people voting? Because that seems to be where the gap is.
Well, how do we get more people voting? I think people, I was saying earlier, people need to feel invested in what they're voting for. I think there needs to be a sense that people feel they can make a difference with voting. We've talked about the voting system, and I think undoubtedly that has an impact. In terms of young people, if we're honest, as a political system, there's quite often a focus on issues that affect older people. We've heard a lot about tax in this election for some reason. There's not been so much around young people. The one exception I'd say around that is around the proposals from the Conservatives around national service, and I'm pretty sure there'll be a lot of young people coming out to vote against that particular proposal this time around.
Yeah, so maybe that's had the effect it needs to have. I do wonder if in terms of developing policy, I would argue that, say, if you were a Conservative party, all your policies are going to be tailored towards those that you think are going to vote for you. And therefore, if the younger generation, for example, are voting Conservative, then the likelihood of you wanting to put policies in place that benefits the young people probably isn't particularly high, because you're not getting their vote. You're going to put the policies in place for the ones that are going to go out and vote, which is typically pensioners, older people, and those with wealth. Do you think that factors?
So I think if you talk to the political parties, they'll all say, we have lots of policies that will attract a whole range of different voters of different demographics and age and everything else. And I think that is true.
Yeah.
But undoubtedly, there's often a focus on those policies that we think are going to be more interesting to voters. And you're right, the older you get, you're more likely you are to vote.
Mike, you've been really generous with your time. I know you've got to get back to HQ, but thank you for coming on and helping to clear up some of this messaging and some of the terminology and the stuff around politics. I think ultimately, what do we want? We've got a democratic country. We want people to go out and vote, and we want the best person for the job to try and make lives better for us. But in order for that to happen, they need to go and vote. Fundamentally, that's what we need at the end of it. Yeah. Thank you for your time, Councillor Mike Ross. Thank you.
Thank you.